wanted to explain a little bit more about floating selvages. A floating selvage is used on either side of your hand-woven piece on the loom to help you have a straighter edge when you're weaving a twill. Sometimes when you weave a twill, the selvage or the sides of the piece can be irregular based on the way that the twill structure is set up. So a floating selvage will help you to have a straighter edge on the side where sometimes the weft gets drawn in more so on some picks and not so much on other picks on your piece. So this tutorial is a quick overview of how to set up a floating selvage. And the floating selvage is tied onto your front rod. And this is the way that it normally is set up. It's actually very easy to do. I cut two pieces. One's going, two pieces of yarn. One will be going on each side of the hand-woven piece. So the first one will get tied on to the right-hand side of this metal rod. I'm just going to make a double knot and tie the end of this piece on to the rod, and after that it'll go through the reed and out the back of the loom just like the rest of the warp, except it won't go through any heddles, and that's where it gets the name floating, because it kind of just floats in between the shed. So I'm going to just thread it through the very next open dent in my reed, like that, and then I will get it through the harness behind there, and you can just drop it down for now, but you want to put it just on the outside of the last heddle, or the very outermost heddle on your piece. And the other piece will go on the other side of your warp. I'm going to just tie this onto the front rod just like I did the one on the right side. Just a double knot. Okay, and then I'll also thread this one through the next open dent in my reed, and that'll also be routed through the opening of your shed or your harness, and you can also just drop that one towards the back. And now we're going to walk around to the back of the loom, and we're going to pull the floating selvage pieces that you tied onto the front over the back beam on your loom, and they're just going to hang so that when you're weaving you can go around this one thread each time that you send a pick through the shed, and that way it'll always pick up the very outermost piece of yarn on your weaving project, and it'll help you to avoid the unevenness of the selvages when you're weaving twill. So what I usually do in order to secure these is I use these empty cones, these yarn cones, and I put a couple of fishing weights into one of them, and then I wrap the other end of the floating selvage around the cone, the one with the weight in it. Just wrap it around that cone until you have a little bit so that you can hang the cone over the back beam. And then you want to put another cone on here and push them in real tight, and that will give you a little weight to hang your thread or your floating selvage yarn off of the back of your beam. Same thing with this, you just wrap this piece of yarn around here and then put another empty cone on that to hold it tight, and then just hang them off of the back of your loom just like that, and that'll give you a little bit of tension without having to secure it to the back rod or apron rod like you did with the rest of the warp. This is just to help keep your selvages out to the side of your piece. So that is pretty much all that I do for my floating selvages. As you weave your piece, you'll notice that it makes a straighter edge when you're weaving a uneven or a twill, like an uneven weave structure. And I think that you'll find that's very handy. You can use floating selvages on any handwoven piece. Some people use them all the time. It's really not necessary to. But when I weave twills, I usually do put a floating selvage on there. Anything that requires the selvages to be a little bit more consistent. Okay, so we came back to the front of the loom after we hung our floating selvages by weights off of the back of the loom. And I've started to weave a little plain weave, and I wanted to show you how you weave with the floating selvages in place. So you can see here that I started a little plain weave, and what I'm doing is when I make a shed, and this particular shed that I'm making is the plain weave shed, the floating selvage is here. It's passing through that slot in the reed that we passed it through, and it's not going through any of the heddles on your shafts. So this piece right here is the floating selvage, and on this side this piece is the floating selvage. You can see that I can sort of manipulate them a little bit, but all you want to do is when you're weaving is take your shuttle and go over the floating selvage through your shed, and when you come out on this side, go under this floating selvage. That way, every time you weave, you'll be picking up those very sides of the piece. Let's do it again. I changed my shed, and now I'm going to, again, as I go into the shed, I'm going to go over the floating selvage on this side and under the floating selvage on this side. So every time you go into the shed with the floating selvage, go over on the entry side and go under on the exit side. And that way you'll start to see where it's picking up the very side piece, and you'll have a straighter selvage than you would normally have if you were just weaving a twill without the floating selvage. So I hope this helps you with weaving twills or like a irregular sided weave structure. Some of the different weave structures are like that. Depends on how many floats you have, because in a twill you actually have a certain amount of floats, even if it's only a 2 yarn float. It still can affect the sides of the piece when you weave. So good luck with your floating selvages, and we'll keep going with some more pointers.